is, I believe, one of the most poorly understood periods in history. From what I gather, most people seem to believe that the colonial powers one day sat around a map at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders around bits they wanted, and that was it. But the scramble had already begun by the time of the conference of 1884, plus the conference stated that any claimant must show effective occupation of a region before it was granted to them. This meant in some instances there were literal races between explorers, far more intense than just drawing lines on a map. During the scramble, great powers like Britain and France nearly went to war. It brought about a revolution in Portugal, and, I'd argue, with the exception of maybe the Zulus and Ethiopians, the Africans and their battles against colonialism are often just completely ignored. Plus, the fact that some African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia actually expanded is also often glossed over. But to understand the scramble, you really need to go back in time. Well, maybe you don't, but there's some fascinating empires, wars, and cultural exchanges beforehand. The first European colonies in Africa were set up by the Portuguese, as bases along their route to India. These included Madeira in the Atlantic, Sofala in Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa. These all proved to be important stopover points for international trade, and this was pretty much the standard for colonialism at that time. It was far more profitable to set up factories for trade and control sea lanes, rather than taking over entire regions. As such, the Portuguese would also set up colonies in the Spice Islands, Hormuz in Persia, and, important to this story, in Oman. The Spanish and Portuguese had agreed to divide the world in two, so they had little competition from Europeans in Africa. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such, the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Mina from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. Plus, for a few decades, they even held Portuguese Luanda. While in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they entered Cape Town, an important midway point for ships sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulu. They were the Khoekhoe. These are often grouped together with the San hunter-gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu, on the other hand, didn't enter the picture for another few decades, as they were Bantu who migrated from the north. However, to further complicate matters, there were also the Xhosa in South Africa at that time, and they are closely related to the Bantu. There is some debate over when the Xhosa arrived, but their language shows that they may have been there a lot sooner, as they adopted some of the click sounds from the local San people. Hence Xhosa is usually pronounced something like Xhosa, but I think it's time to explain a bit about the African people and their kingdoms. So this is going to be a gross oversimplification, I'm aware of that, as I'm trying to explain about 200 years of African history, but here goes. Let's start with the Bantu.